Yeah, hi. In this episode, we say it's episode 30. It's not. It's episode 28. This really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but we can't count. Anyway, enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to Open Door Philosophy, a podcast about philosophy made accessible for listeners. I'm Andrew's former philosophy teacher, Derek Parsons.
And I'm Mr. Parsons' former philosophy student, Andrew Graziano. Welcome to episode 30, where we continue our series on Stoic thinkers with everyone's favorite senatorial Stoic, Seneca. But before that, Mr. Parsons, how you been doing? Spring break is over.
Spring break is over, but spring is not. It's beautiful and in the air. You know, this week I saw for the first time in our garden monarch butterflies. They're migrating through right now. So I've seen a couple every other day. But other than that, I mean, the big news is that my birthday was last week. It's celebrated in many countries around the world, but not formally recognized in the United States. I just wanted to point out the many other very interesting things that happened on my birthday, which was March 25th. So here we go. Of course, it is also the birthday of the great Elton John. I can't believe he shares my birthday. Amazing. But other nerdy cool stuff, if you're into Lord of the Rings, March 25th is a big day. It is the day that Sauron was defeated. The ring was destroyed. For all my Catholic friends out there, Feast of Annunciation, baby, is March 25th also, which there is a connection between that and J.R.R. Tolkien. He used March 25th on purpose as the day that Sauron died. Huh. So anyway, all silliness aside, students were super nice to me at school on my day. They threw me a party. There was cake and everything, which was very sweet. So that's my update. How are you, Andrew? What's going on?
I'm good. I did not know Lord of the Rings. I do not know anything about Lord of the Rings, so I did not know that. And I did not know that J.R.L. Tolkien.
Oh, God bless J.R.R. Tolkien.
I did not know that J.R.R. Tolkien was such a date guy, so that's interesting too.
Oh, yeah. Like we could do a whole episode on J.R.R. Tolkien.
I don't know. I think I'm more of a Harry Potter guy, but
oh yeah,
I've never actually read it before, so maybe that's on my reading list.
Well, J.K. Rowling. What is it with British people abbreviate like C.S. Lewis? What's going on with that?
It's just those British people.
Guess A. Milne. That's a Winnie the Pooh.
Oh my goodness.
Wait, we haven't even talked about your life.
No, that's okay. Nothing really new. It's just the terms winding down. So that's fun. I think, yeah, by the time this episode comes out, Rice will have done Beer Bike, which is our one claim to fame, I think. It's not quite what it sounds. It's based on this old tradition of basically bike races while people are drunk, but it's not really like that anymore. It's just like Rice is super into bike racing. So basically, the one day a year, all the residential colleges race each other and bike. They have like a bike race, so it's super cool. It's like super big deal. People at Rice start training like before school starts every year, so super big bike culture at Rice. Definitely like way bigger. It's like our biggest sport. Biking is like our biggest sport, so it's way bigger than football and basketball and anything. So it's like a huge deal. Yeah,
that's really interesting because Rice is located in such a heavy urban area.
Yep.
And Houston, as with the rest of the United States, is not well known for its bike-friendly motor vehicle awareness.
Not at all.
So that's really interesting. So is it like exclusively on campus, or is it like a big old route throughout the city?
No, it's basically all on campus. We have our own like bike track near the back of campus, and then they kind of had one last year, but they didn't allow people to like go to the track. So I guess they didn't really have it. But yeah, I know people have been training all throughout the year, so it's going to be super fun. Definitely a good time. On our last episode of the Open Door Philosophy podcast, we began a 4-episode series on Stoicism, one of our favorite topics at Open Door Philosophy. And one of the more popular topics, I think, and just like contemporary philosophical popular life. And so last week we did kind of an intro on Stoicism, what it was, what it wasn't, popular conceptions of it, why it was so popular. So if you haven't given that episode a listen, check that out before coming to this one. On that last episode, we identified 3 of the most famous Stoic philosophers. There's a lot more, but they are Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus. Those are out of order, but that's the order that we're going to be doing them in. And so today we are starting on our deep dive into Seneca.
So as Andrew said, referenced in that previous episode, I talked about the era of Hellenism, which is when Stoicism began as a philosophy. And so one of the things I wanted to point out when we're talking about Roman Stoics is that during the Greek period, classical Greek period before Hellenism, where you have the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, the whole crew, and even really in the era of Hellenism, when you have those schools that develop like Cynicism and Stoicism and Epicureanism, those were schools that were new, right? Like that was new philosophy or new philosophical viewpoints and theories and entire systems that were developed and worked out. But when we get to the Roman Republic and especially the Roman Empire, the development of new philosophical systems really kind of goes on pause, if you will. Now, that's not to say that the Romans weren't philosophical. They most certainly were in their approach to living in life. So one thing to point out before we get into these guys, which were just wonderful thinkers, is that Roman philosophy really shouldn't be considered a time period where they're creating new philosophy or philosophical systems. What they're doing is practicing the philosophy. And that's why these philosophers, these thinkers that we're going to look at are so influential, because even though coming up with philosophical systems is very interesting, living out those philosophical systems is really what it's all about in a way. And so these thinkers, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, had the opportunity to live out those philosophies. And so we'll see that there's really nothing new that Seneca says as far as Stoicism, but it's how he lived his life according to Stoic principles that are interesting today.
That's exactly right. That's something we're going to see throughout pretty much all of these thinkers that we're going to see. It's not going to be as much of a development, but definitely more of a, seeing how it's philosophy is a way of life, how it's being developed. And I think I've definitely said this before on this podcast, but I always think this is funny. Maybe I said this last time, I can't remember. I think last year I was talking to one of my professors who specializes in kind of Roman history and stuff. So I was talking to him and I was like, "Oh, do you know any good Roman philosophers?" And he's like, "Nope, none of them are that great." And I don't know if I am misrepresenting a little of the context that came in, so sorry about that. But I think that's kind of a good way to look at it, and also kind of a bad way to look at it, because I wouldn't really say that they're philosophers in the sense that they're not really coming up with anything new. And I've definitely flipped about how my view, I always flip-flop on how I think about these writers as philosophers or not. But that's something important to think about. I think throughout our entire run as podcast hosts, we've really mostly looked at philosophers who develop really new ideas, who are different from each other, and who kind of maybe disagree about the past. I mean, why are they writing if they're not offering something new? And I think that we just kind of have to think about these thinkers differently. They're kind of thinking about questions that exist within a system that's already been established. They're not necessarily turning away from something or trying to alter anything big.
Yeah, and that's certainly not to say that they are not wise, right? If you think of a Taoist sage or a Zen Buddhist sage or something, they're not coming up with new theories, but they're embodying that practice, honing that practice, and really kind of through that practice, they become wiser about that particular school of philosophy, and therefore become masters or sages in the Eastern tradition is what we'd call them. And really, that's what these Stoic thinkers are, right? And I think that in and of itself is a philosophical practice, right? That's embodying a philosophical way of living, because you are doing the things that philosophy does, which is you're taking theories, you're testing them out, you're asking questions of them, you're seeing how well it fits experience, and I think that's definitely philosophical activity.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about how this idea is involved in Seneca's life specifically. But before we do that, I think we should talk a little bit about Seneca's life, going into detail about that, and kind of the context of Seneca too during his life and kind of around it and what's preceding it, just so we have a better idea of what's going on. Do you have anything else you want to add before we start this, Mr. Parsons?
No, I think we're good. Hit it up.
All right. So I think before this episode, Mr. Parsons and I were talking about how Seneca's birth date, I guess rather, is kind of a circa date. There's nothing exactly, but we can kind of think of it at the early. Is it the early first century? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
somewhere. It's in the early first century. I've seen it 1 BC, and then I think Mr. Parsons was saying he's seen it as 4 CE before, and I've seen it like anywhere between those dates. I think is just a
Yeah, well, one of the sources I read said, it's possible that Seneca and Jesus of Nazareth was born in the same
yeah,
year.
yeah,
So it's right around
yeah.
that time.
So just at the beginning of that time, and for any of those of you who are listening who are big Roman history buffs, this is kind of a big time in Roman history. Around 30 years before this, the first emperor of Rome at that time, Octavian, but around the time Seneca is born, it's going to be Augustus. The Republic of Rome has ended, and Augustus is, he's the new emperor of Rome. The system is totally changing. There's more emphasis, of course, on the one Pater Patriae, who's the father of the fatherlands, who's kind of in charge, who's building a lot of grandeur to Rome. Rome's population is fluctuating heavily at the time. Around, I forget exactly. Yeah. So Augustus is going to die in about 14 AD. So that's when Seneca is going to be growing up, when he's a young man. But throughout, I would say throughout 44 BC to 14, when Augustus dies, that's when Augustus is establishing this Roman empire. And so it's certainly something that's rather new. I would say even till, 64 AD, when the Great Fire of Rome happens, there's still a lot of
Hmm.
development that's going on in the Roman Empire. So I think when we're thinking about this time in Seneca's life, we're seeing whenever Seneca's alive, really, we're seeing this massive change in Roman society, in a core integral part of Roman identity about being a republic. And that's what's what Seneca's growing up in. Yet I'm fairly certain that the Colosseum's not even built yet in Rome, something that is so crucial to Roman identity at a later time. But it's just, I guess that doesn't really matter. But what I'm trying to say through all of this is both a key transition point in Roman history, in Roman time, and that's really going to be influencing
Hmm.
Seneca a lot.
Yeah, it was an incredibly politically unstable time. It's hard for us to even really sort of wrap our minds around. You mentioned 44 BC earlier. That's the date that Julius Caesar was assassinated. So Julius Caesar, of course, turns Rome on its head by overthrowing the previous guy and upends the republic system and declares himself dictator for life. And then he's assassinated 3 years later. I think it was 3 years. And then, civil war ensues. And then finally, Augustus, like you said, comes to the throne and is a pretty solid emperor by all accounts. But after that, you had a slew of emperors in that first 100 years of empire that were really unstable,
Yep.
and
Yep.
both mentally and politically. And so I mean, that's the world that Seneca's living in. It was a world of paranoia, grasping for power, and trying to figure out how this new system of empire is working. So all that's very important to, especially some of the emperors we're going to talk about his life. So to get onto it, you mentioned he was born roughly between 4 or maybe 1 BCE. He was born in Spain, what is today Cordoba, which was a province of Rome at the time and quite removed from all the politics. So, being that his family was really well to do, no surprise here, Seneca was given a tutor by his father to help him become educated in the ways of rhetoric and logic and ready to be a statesman. So, he was given a Stoic tutor by the name of Attalus. And Seneca really enjoyed learning as a young child. But Attalus, who of course helped Seneca learn all the things that I mentioned before, like rhetoric, he was also very much so a philosopher. And one of his quotes about the purpose of learning philosophy, Attalus said, "Take away with him some one good thing every day. Every day, the purpose of philosophy is to take away some one good thing every day, that you should return home a sounder man, or on the way to becoming sounder." And when Attalus is saying sounder, he's meaning virtuous. And we talked about that in the previous episode, the importance of the Stoic virtues. Seneca also found a lot of value in studying the philosopher Sextus, which was another Stoic, from whom he discovered like the Stoic practice of journaling a few minutes every evening before bed. I think we mentioned in the previous episode, but journaling is a common Stoic practice. Marcus Aurelius does it in the morning. Seneca does it in the evening. So he picked that up from Sextus. So growing up, he was sort of influenced by Roman Stoic thinking.
Let me say something real quick about Attalus. That's an important guy for, as we'll see, for Seneca. How did you say it, Mr. Parsons? Did you say it?
Oh, I probably
Attalus.
mispronounced
Okay.
it.
I just wanted to stay consistent. I was just looking at the Greek. I guess he's a Greek guy.
Well, that's not surprising either.
Well, anyway, he's a pretty interesting guy in a lot of ways. Apparently, I don't know if this is actually true, like these older writings, but Seneca, in one of his other works, not one that we'll be talking about today, kind of describes his teacher. And for basically, his teacher had all of his land stripped from him by this. Okay, well, we'll do a little bit of Roman history story time. So after Augustus died, I think it was his son or stepson, Tiberius, took over. And there's this very famous guy named Sejanus who was, I think we should think about him as basically like this very powerful bodyguard. He was the head of this group called the Praetorian Guard, who's basically the bodyguard, the secret service of Roman emperors. And Sejanus was very, very powerful. And apparently Sejanus took all of Attalus's property. And basically it says he was reduced to cultivating the ground. And I think we'll definitely see later in Seneca's life how much Seneca himself is going to be kind of screwed over by Roman imperial power. And so probably how Seneca deals with this is going to be based very much on Attalus' own struggles with Roman imperial power.
That's a great point. A lot of things that Seneca writes about is death and cruel fortune, as we could call it. And certainly a lot of that is informed by his youth and what he saw happen with Attalus, and, witnesses the fallout of power struggle, or the fallout of the vice, if you will, of desiring power. Speaking of cruel fortune, let me just run through a list of things that happens to him before he ends up with his ultimate emperor, if you will, the tutor of Nero. So when he was a young man, around 20 CE, so he was about 24 years of age, he was already in court in the government, working in the government. And he always was kind of not necessarily fragile with health, but he did have this sort of reoccurring respiratory issue. So around 24 years of age, it was probably tuberculosis that he developed. And in order to try to recover from that, he went to Egypt, where his uncle was a prefect. So this tells you how well connected his family was. His uncle was a prefect in Egypt. But he ends up staying 10 years there. And when he comes back, on the return journey to Rome, his uncle dies in a shipwreck. And then also Saul, who was once a very well-trusted military general, Sejanus, I suppose is how you say it. Is that who you were talking about earlier?
Yes.
Actually,
yes.
They saw him condemned by the Senate, and he was torn to pieces in the mob in the street. So, here's someone who is incredibly well-respected and had a tremendous amount of power. gets out of favor with the current emperor, and then boom, taken out. It was a time of paranoia, a time of violence, political turmoil, all under the reign of this new emperor after Augustus Tiberius. It is under these conditions that Seneca took his first public office on returning from Egypt. He kept his head down through like this tumultuous reign of Tiberius, and then Tiberius's successor Caligula, which was even crazier than Tiberius. But then Seneca loses his father in 39. He gets married in 40, which is happy times, but then he loses his first son in 41, the very next year. And then 21 days after burying his son, he was banished to the Isle of Corsica by the new emperor, Claudius, and he was 41 years old. We're not really sure why. There's some questions about maybe some infidelity he might have been involved with. But either way, it's for the first, I guess, 20 or so years of his professional life, it's pretty up and down, and we go through 3 emperors. But when he was on the Isle of Corsica, this was a really productive time for him in terms of his writing, both books and letters, and a lot of his famous Stoic writings comes from this time period. All right, it's off to you, Andrew, for Nero.
So someone extremely important in Seneca's later years is the future Emperor Nero. Now, before we talk about Nero, let's go back a little bit and see how Nero is eligible for the throne, because it's a little shady. So Nero is the son of Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina is the youngest sister of Caligula. Nero is like the great grandson of Augustus, basically, and Tiberius. So he has some claim to the throne, but it's basically a little spotty. The main player how Nero gets to power is through basically some meddling his mom, Agrippina the Younger. When Nero was a young kid, this is probably the most important part for now. When Nero was a young guy, Agrippina hired Seneca to be the tutor of Nero. And from a lot of scholarship or whatever, I think we've been able to tell that Nero is kind of like, I mean, a lot of people probably are aware of this, but Nero was just kind of a crazy emperor, like Mr. Parsons mentioned earlier. A lot of these emperors in this time were insane. They're just absolutely crazy. Nero fiddled while Rome was burning. And I don't know, nobody knows if that's true, blah, 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 blah. But I think that's a good way of looking at how crazy Nero was. So anyway, Seneca came back. He was allowed to come back from his exile from Corsica after he was hired basically to become Nero's tutor. I think it was pretty much said that Nero was like a pretty bad student under Seneca. Kind of reminds me of Alcibiades, who was kind of, I'm not going to say taught by Socrates, but was in Socrates' circle and someone who Socrates really cared about. Nero, not a great little kid, but Seneca became one of Nero's advisors when Nero became emperor. And yeah, he was basically helping him out. Seneca was helping him become a pretty good emperor, I would say, at least at the beginning of Nero's term. A lot of people, Nero wasn't really that bad of an emperor, at least at the beginning of his term.
If I could interject here, I think Nero was either 11 or 12 when Seneca becomes his tutor, and then Nero becomes emperor at the age of 16. So Seneca really didn't have a lot of time to tutor the boy as much as he would have liked to have, and the Stoic virtues and trying to lay out a path for how to be a good king and all that sort of stuff. And you can imagine a 16-year-old being emperor of Rome too. Yeah, I believe it's Agrippina who had her husband Claudius poisoned to make room for Nero. So that's why he becomes emperor at such a young age. So like you said, Seneca is an advisor for him for many years afterwards, but really didn't have the time, the groundwork, to lay for him to hopefully be a more just ruler.
I don't want to spend too much time on their relationship, but I think it is important because Seneca writes a few works, and I think some of his letters are kind of, no, I don't know, but definitely one of his works is kind of definitely adding Nero. I think it's like on anger or on clemency or something to lay a groundwork for why the Stoic path was the right path. Anyway, as all things do, all good things come to an end. And so Seneca, like many of these people, apparently was caught up in a conspiracy to kill Nero, allegedly. It's actually very unlikely that he was part of it. Nero ordered Seneca to kill himself, to cut himself and to slash his veins, to die in a bathtub. There's a lot of famous art around that. But, there's also this great philosophical tradition of tyrants, whoever that might be, having to kill themselves by sticking to their philosophy. So I think that's a pretty extensive background that we just gave. Mr. Parsons, do you have anything else to add before we jump into the philosophy of Nero?
Yeah,
Or not of Nero.
right. Not of Nero. We don't want to study his philosophy, although a very intriguing person. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. Nero, as he went through his very short reign, which was only 11 years, he became, well, maybe it's 12 years. Anyway, he became even more and more paranoid and was eliminating everyone that he considered a threat or a rival. And so someone like Seneca, this happened to all kinds of people who worked closely with Nero and some of the other emperors too, that, they were caught up in schemes. Whether they were involved in those schemes or not, is very questionable, and probably not. A lot of people were accused of things they didn't even do just so they could be eliminated because they were seen as a threat or a rival. So it's just really sad that Seneca, who was brought on to be this tutor, this mentor, he probably thought he would be very similar, like Attalus was to Seneca. Hopefully Seneca would be that for Nero, but it certainly didn't turn out that way. And I don't think at any fault of Seneca's, which I know that I believe that weighed on him quite a lot. So if if you look at the life of Seneca, very up and down, right? Like young, grew up young, wealthy, but then tuberculosis and was gone for 10 years and then came back, and then was exiled and then came back, and he's the tutor of Nero, and everything goes horribly wrong, and he's forced to commit suicide. That's how his life ended. So all of that will influence his works, which we're getting ready to talk about here in a minute.
That's the sound of money. Fresh, printed money.
Oh boy, the weather outside, so nice. I think today's high is like 82 degrees and sunny. It's like perfect grilling weather. Do you like to have a good cookout?
I love a good cookout. I really do. I haven't had one in a while, but I do like them.
Yeah, gone are the cold days of winter. It's time to break out the patio furniture and the grill, get the swimming pool floaties blown up. Oh yeah.
Oh, geez. But now that I think about it, I can't crack a cold one with the boys while grilling and watching a real football game on the television on the back deck because I don't have any patio furniture.
You don't have any patio furniture? Well, why would you? You're in a dorm.
Yeah, I guess that would make sense.
It would. But hey, I know there's public areas around there. And, if you wanted to have a cookout, hey, you're in luck because Zeno's Stoa Furniture Outlet has all your patio furniture needs covered.
Zeno? You mean the originator of the Stoic school of philosophy?
Oh, that's right. He taught philosophy on the Stoa, which is Greek for porch.
Hey, I thought we were advertising patio furniture.
Patio, porch. Let's not get into semantics. After teaching so many long lessons to his students, sometimes Zeno just wanted to put up his feet, sit under an oversized umbrella, and chill by the pool.
Zeno had a swimming pool?
Probably not, but he always wanted one. Diogenes told him no. But that didn't stop Zeno from firing up the grill and cooking some dogs for his students.
Well, I'm excited about this spring weather and some outdoor lounging. Let's see. What would I need?
Whatever you need, Zeno Stoa Furniture Outlet has got you covered.
Need a cooler the shape of a giant football to chill your brewskis in? How about a foldable chair so you can get your tan on? Or maybe a fancy patio set with fire pit for those mild evenings?
Zeno Stoa Furniture Outlet has multiple locations, but like most philosophically inspired stores, Zeno's is located exclusively in Greece, but does ship internationally.
Thank you so much, Zeno's Stoa Furniture Outlet, for sponsoring us this week.
And we'd love to thank you, our Stoic listeners, for sponsoring us by listening and passing on Open Door Philosophy to all your friends, when you're standing around the water cooler at work. I don't know that people actually do that, but it's a part of our culture. And they're like, oh yeah, I was listening to this cool new podcast, because everyone likes to sound smart when they say that. And, you feel like you need to jump in. You can be like, hey guys, you got to check out Open Door Philosophy, a podcast about philosophy, making it accessible for you. For the people. What is the people in Latin? Populos, something like that.
Populi, populi,
Populi for
I,
you, the populi.
or the polloi, hoi polloi.
The polis. But hey, listen, in all seriousness, we always thank you guys for listening. We think it's great that you do. And passing along would be fantastic. That is how you can sponsor us. But now, let's get back to our buddy, Seneca.
So much of, I was reading this article about Seneca, and it was talking about how so much of Seneca's life, or how much Seneca's philosophy is informed by his life and the context around him. So I think that's why we spent so much time on the background and the context, because it's so integral on Seneca. He would likely have been a completely, like most of us, I guess, a completely different person if he faced a different context. And that's why it's so important, especially for these Stoic philosophers, this context that they're in. So I guess there's two big works that we're going to talk about, although he definitely has a little bit more. There's very famous, very short work, I believe, Seneca's On the Shortness of Life, and also a little bit of a longer one, but a very good one as well, Letters from a Stoic.
So no surprise that Seneca is very concerned about time and life and the shortness of life because of the health problems that he had and the political instability and seeing people getting assassinated left and right and getting exiled and all these sort of things. Obviously, a big question that all human beings have, no matter what their life situation is like, how should I live my life the best, right? And oftentimes, when people die or we start thinking about death too much, we start thinking about like, oh, geez, like I got to get on with living my life because life isn't long enough. And we're all very fortunate if we are relatively healthy and live out what we would call a full life to probably somewhere between 75 and 90 or something like years old. But there are other people who, of course, have chronic diseases, and that makes life very difficult for them. And of course, other people die unexpectedly, and that's tragic when that happens. And so this big question of like, how should I live my life best, especially given that it seems so short? So to start out, probably one of the most, there's a number of famous quotes from this particular work, but probably one of the most famous ones comes on the first page. And it's really almost like a thesis, right? So Seneca says, it's not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if it were all well invested. But when it is wasted in heedless luxury and spent on no good activity, we are forced at last by death's final constraint to realize that it has passed away before we knew it was passing. So right there at the outset, life is long if we know how to live it, right? So the question is, okay, well, great. That's great advice. It's very inspirational, my friend Seneca. So how do I do that, right? So, of course, a lot of that will involve Stoic practice. So a quote I want to discuss between the two of us comes a couple pages later in the work. Seneca says, but learning how to live takes a whole life, and, which may surprise you more, it takes a whole life to learn how to die. So here we go, Seneca and death. What do you think about that quote, Andrew?
That's a wild quote. One thing before we get into it, I think we've talked about this before, but there's this ever present notion in Stoic philosophy of memento mori, remembering death and kind of coming back to that idea. And so I think, obviously that's present here. Like it takes a whole life to learn how to live and a whole life to learn how to die too. So obviously very big quote about death. I think the quotes, I don't know. I mean, I do think the quote has a lot of merit. I think it's probably true. And, I hate harking on the context again, but I'm sure Seneca probably was thinking about an upcoming death a lot, especially in the context of what he was seeing around him. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Very, very Stoic quote. Like if I saw this quote without a tag or an author, it's very penable to Stoicism. And this is so encompassing of Stoicism too, right? I was talking to a listener before this episode, and they're saying, that's great, Andrew, that you're talking about Stoicism, but I don't really understand what Stoicism is. And I think that one of the key aspects of Stoicism is this notion of death, and in thinking about not letting life slip by.
Yeah, it's a big theme in this work. And a question, I'd have to look up the date when Seneca wrote this, being that my birthday was last week. I'm 49, and that's probably around the time that Seneca wrote this work. And so I have a few more miles on me than I would have, if I were in my young 20s, like you, Andrew. And it is interesting, you look back on, I always question whether or not this is like inevitable, right? Like the silly things we do in youth, and we look back, we're like, oh, geez, I wasted that time. I don't know if that's wasted time, depending on what activities you involve yourself in. But it does seem that like the older you get, the more things do kind of slow down, if you will. Like life kind of slows down a bit, and you experience a lot of more things that perhaps you don't as a younger person, or hopefully don't, such as death. One of my cousins just passed away last week, and one of my good childhood friends, her mother passed away like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So there's some like different perspectives on life that comes with that type of experience, death and tragedy and things like that. And that offers a different perspective that perhaps someone in their teens or their early 20s, or even late 20s doesn't have. So learning how to live takes a whole life. There is this notion of like the arc of human experience and what a person kind of goes through in a normal lifetime, that sort of arc where you have youth and then career building, family building, retirement, and then old age. That's obviously a pretty quick description of an arc of a human life. But I kind of get what he's saying. Learning how to live takes a whole life. You can read lots of books, but I don't know that the knowledge that's in a book about growing older is as effective as, say, experience.
I feel like I can't really talk much about life, but I think just from my perspective, like I think it does help to think about, I don't know. I agree. I definitely agree. My life does feel like it's flying by very quickly. And so I think that's one of the things that was really appealing to me about Stoic philosophy was this idea, almost exactly from this quote. I think thinking about death is very grounding in a lot of ways, and not just my own. And so I think it is something that very much helps set my priorities in line when I do think about it. But it is one of those universal truths. One of the reasons I wanted to study philosophy in the first place was literally because I wanted to figure out how to live a better life or live a good life. But I do definitely agree. It's not going to be this simple. I'm not going to figure it out in 4 years. If I do a PhD, I'm not going to figure out in those 6 years either. It's going to take a whole life. And I could rant on about that subject, but it's unnecessary.
No, I mean, I think these are really profound thoughts, perspectives on living. There is something to like, you got to have some fun. You got to live it up, if you will, when you're younger, and even when you get older, of course, too. But what exactly those particular activities are and how meaningful they are to your experience is all very debatable. And that's why Seneca is having us think about these things, other than one day you wake up and you're 50 and you're like, oh my gosh, like my entire life has just flown by. And he addresses that earlier in the book. One of the quotes he says, he's talking about all the virtues that can lead us towards living a better life. He says, "But among the worst offenders, I count those who spend all their time in drinking and lust. For these are the worst preoccupations of all. Other people, even if they are possessed by an illusory semblance of glory, suffer from at least a respectable delusion." So he's talking about, the things that we catch ourselves in. Moderation is one of the virtues. And of course, something like drinking heavily or being consumed with lust and sex and things like that are pleasurable in the moment, but ultimately become empty pleasures as time goes on. So he asks us to be mindful of those kind of things.
So here's another quote from On the Shortness of Life. Seneca writes, "Some time has passed. He, the philosopher, grasps it in his recollection. Time is present. He uses it. Time is to come. He anticipates it. This combination of all things into one gives him a long life. But life is very short and anxious for those who forget the past, neglect the present, and fear the future."
Yeah. So as a young person, Andrew, who's in undergraduate and you're thinking about the future, whether you're going to do grad school or whatever, does this resonate with you? Do you sometimes get in your head too much about fearing of the future?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very easy to do. And even if I mean, I think like I don't know if I could get away from that. Like I feel like even if I was this perfect stoic, well, I guess then I wouldn't. But even if I was like this great stoic, I'd probably still be fearing for my future. So I don't know if it's reasonable, but it definitely sounds like a nice little quote. That's why I was laughing. Like I don't know.
Yeah, here's this issue of balance here, I think, right? Like we need to be aware of our future and decisions that we make in the future will affect our lives and all those kind of things. Fear of the future, fear is a different thing. I think, I certainly know it's true of my life at times. I've just gotten way too inside my head thinking about things that really I have no control over, and most of those things are in the future or have already occurred in the past. Like I can't change the past and I can't predict the future. So really, what do we have? Well, we have the present. And so if you get to, I think these are all kind of interrelated, right? Like if you fear the future too much, if you spend too much time worrying over the future, you're obviously going to neglect the present, right? Because the future is not here yet. And so, but you're worrying about the future in the present. And so fear of the future neglects the present. But he also says like we shouldn't forget the past. But I also, like the future, I don't think that means dwell on the past, dwell on regrets, things like that.
No.
But be aware of the past and how that past has impacted you as a person. Probably very likely how Seneca was aware of his past and how that impacted him.
This quote, I laughed after I read it. That might get edited out, but or it might not
That's
have
up to
been
you,
picked
man.
up. But
Just let me know.
but it's such like a self-help quote,
Mm.
and I think that this is like one of the reasons why Stoicism has become so popular, because quotes like this do very much seem in a self-help kind of way. That's not to say there's anything wrong with it, because there's not. I don't think there is, at least. But it's just, I don't know. It's just a little funny, and you can see from a quote like this. I mean, it's a beautifully written quote, right? It's beautiful.
No, I think that's
I
a
don't know.
really valid point, Andrew. Like these Stoics have very quotable quotes that are inspirational. I mean, it doesn't take long for you to just Google, any of these Stoic thinkers we've been talking about, and you're going to find articles about how my husband passed away and Marcus Aurelius got me through it, and things like that, because it is inspirational, right? Like another one here from the same work about living now in time. Seneca says, but putting things off is the biggest waste of time. It snatches away each day as it comes and denies us the present by promising the future. The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today. What are you looking at? To what goal are you straining? The whole future lies in uncertainty. Live immediately. And you hear that and you're like, yes, carpe diem, baby. I'm going to go out and do all the things. And
That's funny.
yeah, and so like being inspired, I think, is important,
Yeah.
but you got to do something more with that inspiration. I think there's an entire system behind Stoicism. So if that's a gateway to help people consider what it is to live a good life, then fantastic. But if it's just great quotes that provide you with temporary enthusiasm, that's not going to go a long ways.
Yeah, totally agree. I don't want to talk. We can hold off for a different episode on my problems with Stoicism, and I think I talked a little bit about them last time, but I think that's just something important to keep in mind. These things that Stoics are saying, they're not meant to be easy. They're not meant to be some quote that you put up on your wall or on your phone screen. That it's like a practice. It's tough. It's tough to think this. It's very tough to internalize what Seneca is saying in all of these quotes. And that's only when you're going to get the benefit from them. And that's why he says, like, It takes a whole life to learn how to live.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not easy. It's not something you can do very easily. It's not something you can do by changing your daily routine once or twice. It requires a life.
And I think that go back to that original quote, where it says, learning how to live takes a whole life. That second half of it, it takes a whole life to learn how to die.
Yep.
It's kind of saying the same thing. It's like, you don't want to get to the end of your life and regret that you haven't truly lived, as the old saying goes. But learning how to die, what does Seneca really mean by that? It's sort of inspirational at the outset, but like, what does he really mean by learning how to die? And a lot of it has to do with adhering to these very strict Stoic practices and mindsets, which are difficult mindsets, like thinking about death all the time. Epictetus famously says, when you kiss your child goodbye, tell yourself that you're kissing a mortal and that they could die. These are heavy things. And the purpose of all that is, of course, is for you to have like a detachment to a degree and really focus on what's important. And not losing your mind over things. But yeah, you're right, Andrew. Like these are, although inspirational on the outset, they're very challenging if we truly like attempt to apply them to our lives.
So now we're turning to Letters from a Stoic. I think that one's a little bit more popular than On the Shortness of Life, but popularity doesn't matter. There's a really good quote, in my opinion, from this work, and it is, Seneca writes, "There are more things likely to frighten us than there are to crush us. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Again, I chuckle. Very self-helpy. I guess there's nothing wrong with that too. Like, that's a ad hominem fallacy if I'm saying it's wrong because of that. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. And that's another Stoic thing too, right? Like, we often create more pain, more suffering in our minds than we'll actually face in reality. So that's also another aspect of Stoicism, not letting our mind psych us out, cause us more pain than it has to.
Right, and I think that goes back to the idea of reason as our guiding aspect of our mind. I think we mentioned that in the previous episode. There's such an emphasis on reason coming from the Greek tradition that's a part of Stoicism, not to like completely dismiss the emotions, of course, but that if we're going to get caught up in like some drama inside of our head, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. A popular word that people use, if you want to use that self-helpy lingo, is catastrophizing, right? Is thinking like whatever's going to happen is going to be so terrible and awful that you completely lose yourself in it. And, if we think about those types of moments, when those moments actually occur, they're not nearly as cataclysmic as we think they are. It makes me think also from this other, back to his focus on bad fortune and catastrophizing, I guess. Another quote from Letters from a Stoic. He says, "It is in times of security that the spirit should be preparing itself to deal with difficult times. While fortune is bestowing fares on it, then is the time for it to be strengthened against her rebuffs." So I do think, I don't know if it's quite contradictory. It says we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But at the same time, the Stoic practice calls us to imagine the difficult times that might be ahead of us, to prepare ourselves mentally for those situations. Oh, do you think that's contradictory, Andrew? Or how do we square that?
No, I don't.
I mean, if it's all memento mori, like how do you think about your own death while at the same time not losing your mind over it?
Well, I think the difference kind of lies in purpose, even though that's not the right word either. When we're thinking about the future in the way that Stoics think about the future and want us to think about the future, that's a way for us to be grounded in the present. And when we're thinking, just kind of going by and living life without thinking about the future, with what could go wrong, we're not really living life. We're just kind of living life on autopilot. And so there are really more of exercises to help ground us in the present, to help us be appreciative of what we have, and to prepare us possibly for bad things that go wrong, but really just, I think, to ground us into the future, to make sure our intentions are right. And I think, that this kind of works in a few ways, but one of them too is if we do this in the present and something bad does happen into the future, then we're not looking back on our past and wishing we did something else differently. We're very grounded. So it's a way of grounding ourselves all the time to be in the present.
I think another thing to add to this previous episode, we mentioned Stoics' attempt to follow nature. And if you think about nature, rather not nature like trees and bushes and stuff, but the nature of things, is that nature really has no opinion on what's tragic and what's good. Nature's going to do what's nature's going to do. The functions of life, the function of our planet will do what it's naturally called to do, with or without our influence. And so, death is a part of that natural cycle. So when it comes to like not worrying about things in the future, worry about the things that perhaps you have control over, and then the things that you don't have control over, which would be things that act according to nature. Then you just got to let that go.
Yep.
Way easier said than done.
Yeah, for sure.
Which kind of brings us to this next quote, huh?
Yeah, I think this is a really funny quote. It's, "What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears."
Well, thanks, Seneca.
Some people think Seneca was a tragedian, and so his language, his prose is very, it's very dramatic. I think that's something that we can tell. So the last, and that's why it's fun to read. Like, it's a good time. Maybe not as witty as someone we'll see in our future, maybe not as serious as someone else, but very dramatic.
Yeah, that's something to point out too at this point, right? Like, and maybe we mentioned it in the previous episode, all three of these Stoic thinkers we're going to look at are very different in terms of their personality and how they write. Seneca's a bit, more straightforward and tragic, like you said, whereas Epictetus is like a former slave, and he really shoots from the hip, when he's talking and everything, and his writing's far less formal. Another quote that I'm thinking of in relation to the previous one is another one that's very dramatic. Seneca says, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh.
If you think about the tragedies in his life, which he had plenty, I can see probably why he would have that particular opinion.
Yeah, for sure. He's a dramatic guy. That's I think all we have to say.
Here's another quote that deals kind of with virtues and popular thinking, right? So this one, he's always, we saw this earlier, he's always saying to do things like avoid luxury and avoid fads and all that stuff, which is really comical coming from him because he had outrageous fortune. Not fortune in terms of luck, but money. He was very well to do, even in his exile, right? But anyway, he says here in another letter, "The simple way of life need not be a crude one. The standard which I accept is this: one's life should be a compromise between the ideal and the popular morality." I think that's an interesting one. One's life should be a compromise between the ideal and the popular morality. Because, like, as a Stoic, wouldn't you think, you would try to follow the ideal, but maybe compromise is more realistic? I don't know.
It sounds kind of like Mill. When Mill's writing about utilitarianism, he says, "You can live this utilitarian life, but you need to use your kind of culture's view of morality as a roadmap for your way of living a utilitarian life. You can't just be a cynic, like the cynics in the old term, and kind of just throw yourself on the streets and be and not kind of conform to society," because I think that's an important part about Stoicism. You have to be a member of society.
Mm-hmm.
You have to an extent, follow their rules. I think not as much of it's more of a guide map. I think it's more of a guide map like Mill. Like you need to follow the laws. You need to follow some conceptions of morality. But, you also have to balance that with what you think is true.
I think here again we see this concept of balance, right? And you think maybe back to Aristotle's golden mean. There's got to be the middle. I don't know if the middle ground is always preferable, but it seems like, at least in this quote, in some things, it's the good advice.
I think the big thing, we've talked a lot about Seneca. I think the two big things to take away, or maybe three, a lot of Seneca's work is influenced by the time that he lives in, both personally and culturally. So I think that makes him a very attractive read to people who are going through a lot of hard times. Seneca, we talked about a key component to Seneca is thinking about death, thinking about life, shortness of life, how to live a good life. That's why I do think he is a good kind of introduction to Stoicism in our journey through it. We also talked about how his Stoicism is not something that's completely new, but he's thinking about how to be a Stoic. And I think that's why it relates to his times. He's not developing anything new, but he's thinking about Stoicism in his time that he's living in and things that he's going through. And that really helps us, that's good because we can see it through his perspective of things. Do you have anything else that you want to add, Mr. Parsons?
No, I think that's it. Other than, I think I mentioned it earlier, that the three writers we're looking at are very different. Seneca even writes in a very formal tone, according to the translation that I read, the translator notes. And so some of our other Stoics do not write in such a formal tone. So if you do pick up any of these works and you're like, Seneca's not really doing it for me, that's hardly the only Stoic that you can reference. And his writing may be a little more formal than you prefer. Although I would say his letters are probably less formal than some of his specific written works, like on the shortness of life. But anyway, if you pick up Seneca and he's not for you, but you're still interested in Stoicism, just know that there are other ones that we will introduce soon. You can check them out yourself.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, all right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this episode on Seneca. We really enjoyed talking about Stoicism, so I think these episodes will be a little bit longer, but hopefully you'll enjoy our excitement.
Yeah, being that we enjoy it so much, just let us know what you're thinking about some of these Stoic ideas. We'd be happy to engage with you and have a dialogue about it. So you can catch us on at our email, opendoorphilosophy@gmail.com. But you can also find us on Instagram at opendoorphilosophy and my Twitter, which is D_Parsonage. We do have an official Open Door Philosophy Twitter, but most of that gets redirected to me, so check us out there.
We'd also love if you would I don't know if you can but you can definitely subscribe and leave a positive review on this episode, so we would really appreciate that for you to do. And we'd also like to give a quick shout out to Kevin MacLeod for the use of his free music. It's very groovy, so thank you again for choosing the path that you did, Kevin.
Absolutely. So everyone, have a great week or two till we hear from you again, or till you hear from us again. And, remember, whenever your life is in need of some philosophy? Yeah, whenever your life is in need of some philosophy, the door is always open. See you guys later. What if, because Rice is such a smart school, what if you guys forego the actual track and just you got a bunch of stationary bikes in a room and in your heads you had a bike race?
That'd be funny, but I think people like the wipeout moments.
Oh, well, sure.
And then people wipe out, and also a big thing from this, I can't do this. Like I said, it's called beer bike. So the riders used to chug a can of beer awesome. And then get on the bike. But now, I guess they can't do that because underage drinking and stuff. So now what they do is they have people called chuggers who chug a huge bottle of water, probably a 24-ounce bottle of water as fast as they can. You can chug beer if you're over age, I think, but I don't think anybody does that. But yeah, they chug a huge bottle of water. And so that's always very interesting to watch too.
It seems like they've taken all the fun out of it, if I'm to be honest.
It's funny. I don't know. I think
yeah, I'm not saying that riding bike while drunk is recommendable, but oh man. Well, I don't know how Seneca would have felt about all of that. He'd probably say, go for it. Sounds like a great time.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll see on today's episode.
Okay, well, let's get to it.